Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you all for being here. We just drove up from Dallas, so alhamdulillah. May 1997, I stand on the steps of Duke University Chapel. A Duke newspaper featured 6 out of 3,400 Duke graduates whose stories they found remarkable. I was selected among those 6. I had just finished a bachelor's in electrical engineering. I was on my way to pursue a PhD at Duke in an entirely different discipline, Islamic studies. Now, 25 years later, it blows me away to read these lines printed in the article. Jamillah will specialize in Islam in America. She hopes to eventually become a professor and write books. Jamillah commented, Islam in America is an area that has barely been explored by academia. At this point, people have not respected it as a field, but it's the fastest growing religion in America, and I think people are going to have to stop and take note of it. Obviously, when I made these comments, I had no idea that the tragedy of 9/11 would happen, pushing Islam to the forefront of the American media as anti-peace, anti-American, and anti-woman. What I did possess 20 years ago, however, was the passion to share with the world my understanding of Islam, a religion that I knew to be pro-peace, pro-American, and pro-women. My passion to share the truth about Islam came from faith, and my faith, alhamdulillah, made me a visionary. I could see what others could not because of the faith community that I grew up in, a vibrant African-American Muslim community in Atlanta. As you can see from the slide, women in my community are highly visible or seen to connect with our theme today through the scene. In my mother and all the women in my masjid, whom I call community mothers, I grew up witnessing beautiful, inspiring models of what it means to be a Muslim woman. Faithful, intelligent, stylishly modest, kind, determined, and surrendered to God. I watched these sisters, as we called our elders, lead as teachers, directors, fundraisers, consultants, lecturers, event planners, cooks, writers, and artists. The types of activities in which these women carried out these roles included founding and running full-time Muslim schools, organizing Muslim fashion shows, arranging community workshops and a range of topics, establishing shelters for Muslim women and children, participating in interfaith outreach, producing Muslim television shows, leading Girl Scout troops, and feeding the homeless. So again, this is like in the 1980s, 90s. My faith community made me a visionary, though, well before I stood on the steps of Duke University Chapel. I have this excerpt from, that was in my senior yearbook. More than anything, Jamillah wants to play a role in the growth of Islam in America and the positive growth of the African American community. I went to a Muslim private school all my life. Sister Karim Muhammad School, Morgan Muhammad High. And at some point, that was published or printed May 3rd, 1993. And that's our senior classroom. And I just somehow made on the cover of the New York Times. Growing up, I said that I always wanted to teach Islam to Black people. And sure enough, by Allah's grace, I landed my first job after graduate school at a historically Black college for women, Spelman College. And I wanted to teach my people because early on it was imparted to me that Islam was a liberation faith, or is a liberation faith. I grew up hearing stories such as this one. When my mother was a little girl, after she played all day in the hot sun, she would spend hours and hours in the tub hoping to wash away the sun's mark. So she would literally try to wash her suntan off. My mother shared this story with me in my studies to convey the real psychological impact of racism. But her higher aim was to teach us the blessing of Islam and its healing the wounds of racism. Islam was liberating to my mother because it was the first time that she heard a liberating narrative about Blackness. She first heard it when she read the autobiography of Malcolm X. It was like my mind was being unshackled to know that Black was beautiful, that I'm beautiful, that brown is beautiful, that kinky hair can be beautiful, thick lips could be beautiful, and it was wonderful because that was me. In 1971, my mother joined the Nation of Islam because of this message. In 1975, my mother followed Imam Muhammad into true Islam after the death of his father, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. Born in 1976, I grew up in a community of Black men and women converts who taught me to see Islam as a religion that elevates and raises people up. So it was my upbringing and this amazing history that led to my interest in writing and teaching about Islam and the Black experience. The focus on women came in because they were always at the center and were important role models for me. It wasn't until graduate school, however, that I understood their importance. I told my grad advisors that I wanted to focus on Islam and race for the reasons I've already described. They said that I had to do something about women. I had to. I responded, why? I had very little knowledge of feminism and actually thought it was something to be avoided. Even back in the 1990s, the feminist narrative that Islam was oppressive to women. And I was concerned that focusing on women would mean that I have to play into that narrative that Muslim women are oppressed. It was my professor, Miriam Cook, who helped me understand that through the lens of feminism, as I defined it, I could show that in fact Muslim women are empowered by their faith. Miriam Cook introduced to me alternative feminist approaches, Black feminist thought in particular. The work of Black feminists who look at the ways in which discrimination against Black women occurs at the intersection of gender and race became very influential to my work. When I was learning about Black feminist thought, the faith piece came up. Because my faith has always been a part of who I am, I wanted to look at the intersection of race, gender, and faith for Muslim women. I also wanted to respond to Dr. Paula Giddings, a visiting scholar at Duke, who taught my course on Black feminism, and she was saying the Nation of Islam was oppressive. It was an opportunity to engage and correct her and other feminist scholars. So as my title suggests, between faith and feminism, I literally found myself between faith and feminism. Responding to the Western narrative that Islam and feminism contradicted each other, I wanted to prove to feminists that women did indeed find gender liberation in Islam. And it turned out that the women who taught me to love my faith and to be a woman of faith, African American women, are the best women to prove Islam's liberation. Why? Because one, they are converts, and two, they are Black women who are generally seen as strong and independent. If independent Black women choose Islam for themselves, it has to be a religion favorable to women. All right, and here, let me just say that many of you may know Anna is very controversial now because of her leading the mixed gender prayer. But she was actually one of the first to actually write for her dissertation a piece about the Quran and women, looking at the Quran from a woman's perspective. And there was nothing really radical about it. But at the same time, no one did that before. The beauty and blessing of focusing on my African American community mothers is that they have an intimate relationship with the Quran. As converts, they can't simply absorb their religious understanding from culture, as a Desi woman once told me was the case for her growing up in Pakistan. And by the way, South Asian immigrant Muslim women were the first group of women I researched formally and extensively, and I'll come back to that. My African American community mothers truly sought the Quran as their primary source of guidance. And because they couldn't read Arabic initially, and still most cannot fluently, reading the Quran always meant reading it with understanding in English. All of this meant that my pursuit to correct and revise the feminist narrative that Islam oppressed women will require that I too have an intimate relationship with the Quran. Alhamdulillah, this had already occurred because of what I had inherited from my community mothers. As previously mentioned, my community mothers came to Islam through the Nation of Islam. They did not practice the faith as we do until Imam Warthi Muhammad succeeded his father in 1975 and immediately established prayer and the other pillars of our faith, and of course, correcting the teachings of the Nation of Islam. And he did that immediately. Imam Warthi Muhammad literally walked a whole generation through this faith. This was before the internet, this was before the flood of books and Islamic literacy in this country. They were, in a sense, especially in the beginning, at his mercy and guidance. And in 1975, they fasted their first Ramadan, and it was in September. And he told them that every day in Ramadan, they had to read a juz of the Quran so that by Ramadan's completion, they would have completed it in its entirety. And I, too, grew up with this expectation as well, and it was only until I went to college and was around other Muslims like you that I realized that completing the Quran in Ramadan was not an obligation. But Imam Warthi Muhammad made it one for us. Why? Because he wanted us to understand the Quran for ourselves and have an intimate relationship with Allah's book. So at that time, again 20 years ago, already connected with the Quran, but now a graduate student and being trained to speak about Muslim women and gender, it was expected that I would do that one day, I would often approach the Quran in light of feminism. Is this a book for women and favorable to them? Back then and now, my response to that question has been, is not Allah Ta'ala the God of women and men, and therefore His book of guidance be for His beloved creation, women and men. The Quran is pro-woman as much as it is pro-man. The other way I've approached that question, and it has what distinguishes me as a scholar in my field, is by actually witnessing African American Muslim women of faith. In fact, the theme of this year's Indian Census is perfect for the way that I approach the Quran and women. Through the scene, through my community mothers, I can firmly see Allah's love and wisdom. Through my mothers, I can see what feminists often cannot, and unfortunately, even what many Muslims don't see. And that is the perfect justice and wisdom in the Quran for women and men. I can see it by witnessing Muslim women of faith who are living the Quran, living its gender practices, and doing so with pleasure. I am reminded of the last ayah of Surah Ali Imran, and remain conscious of Allah so that she might attain to a happy state. When I see women who are doing what God asks of them, whether it is covering, praying, fasting, or not praying or fasting because they are on their monthly cycle, and carrying out God's commands with pleasure and joy and with style and beauty, for example, when it comes to their dress, I know that the Quran is for women. Does this mean that these women have never questioned the Quran? Or have they been like feminists and asked, why do we have to cover and men do not? Why can men have more than one spouse and women cannot? Why do women inherit only half of their brothers, that of their brothers? Why can't women pray in front of the men or with the men? Of course, these women have asked these questions. Although most African American Muslim men do not identify as feminists, we approach gender issues in the Quran with feminist attitudes, which is, I believe, inescapable for our context and time. Questions arise when the Quran seems to grant one gender privileges over the other, conflicting with our cultural notions of what gender justice should look like. We bring our questions, we seek explanations from traditional and modern tafsir, and we often produce our own answers. We explain and we justify verses in ways that we imagine will benefit women, or we assert that time-specific verses do not apply to our collective social circumstances or to our personal needs. All of this can really be labeled feminist. And this approach, this type of questioning, there is no contradiction with it in our faith. Not only is it the Sunnah, but women's protests, and one woman in particular that I'm going to talk about today, has actually led, no, more than one woman. I'm thinking of Salama, even think of Jamillah, that's the sort of Jamillah, right? Where a woman is complaining, she's answered. Okay, but women's protest has actually led to Quranic revelation. Some of our favorite verses relate to women. Salama is one of the more known wives of the Prophet ﷺ, and highly regarded for the role that she played in assisting the Prophet ﷺ at Hudaybiyah when the companion's faith was tested. This faithful and thoughtful mother of the believers once addressed the Prophet ﷺ, "O Messenger of Allah, men go to battle, but we do not go to battle. And we earn 1/2 of the inheritance that men get." If Salama does not sound feminist, comparing what men can do and what women can or cannot do. And this was the revelation that came down, and what an honor to be the reason for revelation, or for your question to be the reason for revelation. In Surah Isa, ayah 32. "And do not crave what Allah has given some of you over others. Men will be rewarded according to their deeds, and women equally according to theirs. Rather, ask Allah for His bounties. Surely Allah has perfect knowledge of all things." What a spiritually nurturing ayah. It stirs us away from envy in general, which is not good for the soul. It recognizes the efforts of both men and women. Each has equal potential in the eyes of Allah Ta'ala. And what I love most about it is that it redirects us to ask Allah for bounties, not human beings. It is like the hadith that states that if you ask Allah. Not only is this spiritually satisfying to seek from Allah, since He is the source of anything we can ever want, but it's also quite feminist. Interestingly, 2 ayahs after this one, Allah Ta'ala states that men are the financial supporters of women. True, there are human beings that we depend on, and within the family, ideally the wife depends on her husband. But this is a reminder that husbands are the means of Allah's bounty, not the source. That if we ask of Allah, He has the power to use our husbands to grant what we seek from Allah. I know of one other occasion where Salah was questioning is the cause of revelation. For it to happen twice, for her to question and receive a revelation, or the cause of revelation twice, indicates that Allah does not silence Salama for asking. In fact, I would imagine that she would continue to ask so that she could continue to be the reason for revelation. The other occasion is when Salama, may Allah be pleased with her, the wife of the Prophet, said, I said to the Prophet, why is it that we are not mentioned in the Quran as men are? Why are we not mentioned in the Quran? Then one day, this is her reporting, then one day, without my realizing it, he was calling from the minbar, and I was combing my hair. So I tied my hair back. Then I went out to the chamber in my house, and I started listening out, and he was saying from the minbar, Ya ayyuhan nas, Ya ayyuhan nas, inna Allah ta'ala yaqul. So it's just saying that Allah says, and then he offers a revelation. Allah said this to the people. Inna al-muslimina wal-muslimati wal-mu'minina wal-mu'minati. I know many of you know the ayah. I know we have some kuffar in here. But it goes on to list all these virtues, and it states it in the masculine and in the feminine. Surely for Muslim men and women, believing men and women, devout men and women, truthful men and women, patient men and women, humble men and women, charitable men and women, fasting men and women who guard their chastity, and men and women whom Allah often. For all of them, Allah has prepared forgiveness and a great reward. And this is one of the ayahs that the women speaking about Islam and gender wanted to show that Islam is liberating women. This is one of our favorite ayah. And especially important in showing that certainly in the eyes of Allah, intellectually, spiritually, that there is no distinction between men and women, but certainly in our social roles, in our physical makeup, etc., which also impacts our social roles. This way of rendering Salama's question and protest as aligned with a feminist outlook is an example of the type of gender analysis of Islamic sources and practice that I began to do or carry out in graduate school. The ayah, however, that has impacted my research and personal life the most is the beginning of ayah 434 that begins with Ar-rijalu qawwamun 'ala an-nisa. In the English, men are the caretakers of women, as men have been provisioned by Allah over women and tasked with supporting them financially. What really intrigued me about this verse is how my community mothers adored it and used it for their benefit. Meanwhile, the feminist and even progressive mainstream American idea was that gender roles such as men upholding gender roles like men as providers, breadwinners, they were old-fashioned and sexist. And in my first term paper on gender and Islam in graduate school, I explored the appeal of this Quranic statement that men are supporters and providers. And in that paper, I began to theorize that its appeal goes back, at least for my community mothers, it goes back to their struggles during slavery, or Black women in general struggles during slavery. And I'm going to revisit this later. But I also began to consider the verse appeal in a broader context of women's struggles beyond just Black women. The statement that men financially support women led me to notice that nowhere does Allah Ta'ala state women's roles so clearly. Never does Allah state that women are the ones who cook and clean, for sure. It does. However, in many places in the Quran, mothering is mentioned with great honor, and the hardship of this female-only role is recognized. I skipped the line, you know. So that, nor does a law state, though, even that women are the mothers. Like it says, you know, men are the ones who provide. It never says that women are mothers, but it does recognize motherhood in places. In one place, Surah 46, Ayah 15, we have commanded the human being to treat his parents kindly. His mother carried him with hardship and delivered him with hardship. His bearing and weaning took a full 30 months. And when he has grown to full strength and reaches the age of 40 to say, Lord, help me to be truly grateful, your favors to me and to my parents, help me to be good, to do good work that pleases you, I am one of those who devote themselves to you. So isn't it striking that the ayah begins with gratitude towards both parents, but immediately the mother's role is singled out and is distinguished as very hard. Indeed, the Quran singles out mothering as a tremendous task, deserving the utmost respect. I began to see the statement of men as providers as a reminder to men to take their responsibilities seriously, given women's enormous task as mothers. Interestingly, it was this feminist approach to the Quran, this pursuit to understand how the Quranic charge for men to support women was liberating for women, that I did the opposite of what feminists would do. And that was leaving my job as a tenured professor. So I'm joking about, I was talking about graduate school. So here's how it all happened. It was 2008, the year we elected our first Black president. It had been 4 years since I completed my doctorate in 2004 and became the first Muslim professor to teach in the religious studies department at Spelman College in Atlanta, my hometown. I was pregnant with my first child and completing the manuscript for my first book, which was originally my dissertation on race relations between African American and South Asian Muslim women. So that's where I spent a lot of time with Desi women. Yes, it talks about race relations in general, but a focus on women, and I do have my books for sale afterwards. Okay, so there's a picture of me expecting. In addition to teaching full-time and writing my book, I was traveling for speaking engagements, including to Princeton and to Toronto for the RISC convention, all while pregnant. I began to revisit verse 434, men are the caretakers of women, in light of my own life. My husband could manage could manage without my working, but here I was, the one working the same as a man, but also pregnant or breastfeeding and pumping milk while at work. And dropping and picking up my kids from the daycare, or my one child at that time, and cooking meals later. Anyway, yes, my considerate husband would wash milk bottles and do laundry, but he never agreed to split the household chores equally. I'm glad you all had a chance to see my husband. And most of you have a visual. In most American households where women work, they still do most of the domestic work. And it just didn't make sense to me. Here I was blessed with a situation that many women would die for, a reliable, God-conscious husband who could solely provide for his family. Why then would I assume both the work of provider and the work of mother, which only a woman can do? It became clear to me that I needed to pay attention to this divine gift, women's unique ability to produce life and all that was entailed in this miracle. The pregnancy, the labor and delivery, the healing, the breastfeeding, the unbridled bond between mother and child, and the mother's position as the first teacher. That I had my first baby prematurely heightened my introspection. I discovered that African American women are at least twice more likely than white women to experience preterm labor and infant mortality, independent of socioeconomic class and education. This brought my thoughts back to African American women's attraction to verse 434. Was my having my son early a sign nudging me to reflect and do something differently, for all Black women to do something differently? What has been our legacy of work in this country? How has slavery and racism shaped the way that we labor and over-labor? The labor of birthing and raising children, and the labor that men carry out too. Was God telling me to leave work and be a mother? Allow your husband to take full care of you while you dedicate yourself to the awesome task of mothering? But the idea of leaving work was daunting, and my greatest fear was the thought of my husband losing his job. However, the Quranic verses stating that God is the best of providers ultimately empowered me to overcome my fears. In the faithful pursuit of feminism, Quranic affirmations provided me the courage to be a mother. I stepped out on faith and resigned from my job. I was living in Malaysia at the time on sabbatical after acquiring tenure. Although I loved work at Spelman, it was just the beginning of my work as a community scholar. I began my first blog, Race, Gender, Faith, to account my experiences in Malaysia. I signed a contract to write a second book co-authored by a scholar in the UK, and upon my return to the US, I received a steady flow of invitations to speak on college campuses and Muslim conferences. My career could not have been better, and my husband never lost his job. Alhamdulillah, through the scene, Allah's ayat in the Quran and that signs in my own life as a working mother, I firmly believe that Allah will take care of me, and surely Allah rewarded me for my faith in the unseen. And this is the story of how faith and feminism led a Muslim scholar home, literally to be a stay-at-home mom, which also expanded into homeschooling. Well, that's part of the story. Here's the other story of how it led, how faith and feminism led me to my spiritual home. This image was recently created by an artistic friend of mine, the poet Sakina Noor, or formerly Sakina Pilgrim, from a picture taken in a mosque in Senegal in 2021. I share this image here because it captures my spiritual practice well before 2021, which began to emerge 20 years before when I was in graduate school. In the summer of 2001, I attended a 2-month DEEN intensive in the Bay Area with Sheikh Hamza Yusuf and Imam Zaid, Shaka, and other traditional scholars. I had a magical experience there that time is not permit me to give detail, except I would say that I was badly in need of funding to carry out my dissertation research in Chicago. I had applied for 2 research grants, but I was denied both of them. Well, when we were outside of Oakland, every morning after Fajr, we recited Surah Yasin, followed by the weird litanies of the great scholar, Waliullah, Imam al-Haddad. When I returned to Atlanta and I checked my emails, remember this was before smartphones, so I didn't have access to emails, so I was at home. I noticed that I had been selected to receive one of the grants originally denied to me. And I attribute this miracle to the spiritual work that we carried out at the DEEN Intensive. For this reason, it was important for me to maintain my spiritual practice. I was also inspired by this quote from Imam al-Ghazali: "You should not neglect your time or use it haphazardly. On the contrary, you should bring yourselves to account, structure your litanies and other practices during each day and night, and assign to each period a fixed and specific function. This is how to bring about spiritual blessing in each period." So I desired an ambitious spiritual practice for the blessing, but also it was just something that I don't know, I just had that yearning to be in that space. And this just like kind of disposition that I had, it also contributed to my decision to leave my full-time work at Spelman. Because being at home would provide me the time to really devote to my spiritual practice. Eventually, my practice would lead me to connect with a global spiritual community led by sheikhs from a small village in Senegal called Medina Bay. In 2020, 10 years after leaving Spelman, I was presented with a travel opportunity that I could only take because I was homeschooling my now 3 sons, because neither I nor my children were limited or attached to any institution. We could travel. A close friend of mine invited me to live with her in Medina Bay for a year while our sons attended Quran school. I loved the idea, but thought that my husband would never agree. I didn't realize he was still here. But as was shared earlier, bounty is from Allah, not our husbands. So I asked Allah first, and when I subsequently asked my husband, miraculously, he said yes. Soon after arriving in synagogue in January 2021, I received an email from a professor at BYU in Utah, inviting me to speak about a common gender conference in October. I declined because I was in Senegal. Come September, he invites me to come again, and he says, you can do it over Zoom. So I said yes, and I decided to write this talk on gender, but it would be very different and fascinating because I was going to be doing it from the lens of Medina Bay. And alhamdulillah, it turned out to be a really great talk where even BYU, a dean there, did invite me back. Last year I went back. And I also just thought it was one of my best talks. And then it just made me think about, what the quote by al-Ghazali, that, just the blessing that that any period or any work that you're doing is filled with, when you are through the remembrance of Allah. So I want to end with just a part of that talk. And also, before sharing that, Medina Bay is a place I call home because it is the home of my ancestors and the place where my heart feels most spiritually aligned. And it is where my 20-year journey studying, living, and speaking on faith and feminism reached its highest point. at least for now, inshallah. So here's some of that talk. The setting of the magical Medina Bay Mosque courtyard, which includes a mausoleum that you see on the left side, is a great entry point to sharing my life's work on how African American Muslims love and live Islam, navigating Islamic gender roots and norms in light of family, community, and work. Here in Medina Bay, experiencing Islam is in a culture different from my own. It is as though I'm seeing Islam with new eyes, very much like a convert. And interestingly, the women whom I center in my research are converts, formerly Christian women who came to Islam. Black Christian women, in contrast to white women, have always demonstrated a unique ability to see beauty in Islam. And what's so striking is that what I see of Islam with fresh eyes, and what I love about Medina Bay parallels much of what Black Christian women have found appealing about Islam in America. I captured what I love through three themes, all of them most vividly experienced in the sacred space of the mosque, and I'll just share one of those themes. Hands down, what I love the most about the mosque complex in Medina Bay Synagogue is that young Black men dominate the space. Women are there and are highly visible, but men outnumber them by far. In the slide is a picture at the tombs, which women frequent, and you look closely on the right and you can see a woman in yellow hijab sitting among other women. And notice the man standing in blue with a white scarf. Senegalese men regularly wear this covering that looks like a hijab in various colors. Now, as someone who occasionally identifies as an Islamic feminist, it might be surprising to hear that I love the way men hold most of the sacred space. Perhaps this paradox is the perfect place to pose an important question. Whose definition of women's liberation are we using to judge Islam? Whose story are we telling? Is it Muslim women's story? Black women's story? Neither. It is white Christian women's. White women are the ones who have crafted the dominant narrative of women's liberation in this country. Because white women's place has been in the home, liberation for them meant breaking out of domestic confines and gaining equal access to jobs and wages, as well as other public spaces led by men. This sounds like freedom, but in reality it has not been for Black women. Unlike white women, African American women have had much more to worry about than discrimination based on gender. Black women have told a different story of women's liberation. Racism affects our lives so profoundly and pervasively that we cannot effectively address sexism without addressing racism. I appreciate the way that activist and poet Nikki Giovanni captures this difference in the stories of feminism, where Black women were not even seen as a female body to be protected, but rather a Black body to be exploited. Giovanni stated, when we look at the history of slavery, we have a whole situation where no one cared if you were a woman or not. You had to get out into the field. After freedom, no one cared if you were a woman or not. You had to work to support your family. So that's one of the problems that women live in relation to Black women. They look at themselves as women, but we have to look at ourselves as Black. Giovanni is right to begin with slavery to understand why Black and white women see feminism differently. Black women's beginnings in this country were defined by unrelenting work for white people: washing, ironing, cooking, scrubbing, sewing, mending, hoeing, plowing, digging, planting, pruning, patching, to borrow words from Margaret Walker's famous poem, For My People. Jacqueline Jones in her book, Labor of Love, Labor of Sorrow, Black Women, Work, and the Family, notes that sun up to sundown is the expression commonly used to describe the work hours of the enslaved. For Black women, it was dawn to midnight. After tending the fields, they began their night work for their own families and communities. All this means that going to work is not the meaning of liberation for Black women. Black women have always worked. What I have discovered among Black Christian women across generations is that they assess Islam based on their own stories of women's liberation, shaped primarily by racism. Black women are sensitive to the ways in which racism functions as a broader injustice that affects an entire community, women, men, and children. Hence, our feminism also takes into account how racism has affected Black men and how that affects our lives as women. So take, for instance, my intro to Islam students at Spelman. I had to visit a mosque and report their observations. Again and again, these young Black Christian women noted the men and how abundantly present they were. One student described the men in the mosque as a beautiful sight to see and noted so many young ones. She wrote, it was beautiful to see so many Black males gathered together peacefully, shaking hands and greeting each other with love and respect. Their unity opposes the popular media images that convey that Black men are divided. The women notice the men because their experience is that women dominate men in the church. Across denominations and racial makeup, women generally make up over 50% of church congregants, with one of the highest participation of women in historically Black Protestant churches, where women comprise 59% of participants, and the men 41%. This does not mean, though, that black men are less religious in general. Black men attend church more than do white men and women. Like the majority of black women, most black men state that religion is highly important to them. Black women are, however, more religious. It should come as no surprise that the most religious group of Christians, black women, would find it highly intriguing to walk into a religious service, a masjid, and find that 65% of its congregants are men. The predominance of men in the mosque has to do with the gender rule in Islam. Men are required to attend the Friday congregational prayer, whereas it's optional for women. In the mosque that I grew up, I was accustomed to men attending in large numbers. I was not expecting Ms. President in the mosque to do the big deal that it was for my students, but when I traveled to Medina Bay Synagogue, I understood fully their lack of black women's high school presence in sacred space. In the sacred space of Medina Bay, I see a flood of black men around the clock as worshipers and lovers of God and the prophets, etc. Several cultural markers here amplify their spirituality, including their dress, which is modest, often regal, fitting for the divine. They're always carrying liquor beads, which are used for daily devotions, and their constant presence in sacred space, no matter the time of day or night. But also I knew that my pleasure with Ms. Predominance in this space had to do with how black men are portrayed in the media. Similar to the way the Spelman student highlighted that seeing black men peacefully gather together opposes popular media images. Indeed, to see black men not as bodily threats, the way that they are seen in America, but as spiritual aspirants is relief to my eyes and satisfaction to my soul. This is because the demonizing images of black women and boys has a huge emotional impact in our hearts as women who fear that our husbands and brothers will be victims of police brutality, or our sons among the 1 out of 3 black boys who will one day be incarcerated, all because black males are assumed guilty the instant they see them. Because my heart and soul yearn to see black women in their best image, a service of God, to see young men flood the sacred space of Medina Bay takes on extraordinarily positive meaning for me. And I would end there. So thank you. I don't think we have time for questions, but I'll be around and I sell my books for $25 each. Working? Okay. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Jamillah Karim, for that incredible talk. We would next like to welcome our gold sponsor, NAMCC.